Kim Peets and welcome to My Story, His Story. What do we know about Seventh-day Adventist church leaders and how has God influenced them? In this series we take a closer look at the lives of these senior leaders and invite them to share their stories with us. Sitting with me is Miss Moe Ioane, who is a pastor and youth specialist. Welcome, Moe.
Hi, Kim.
It's so good that you could be here with us today.
Thank you.
I feel in company of another woman. It's lovely.
Just relax.
Well, this is quite something different from where you were brought up, isn't it?
Yes, very different.
Where were you brought up?
Well, I was born in the beautiful island of Samoa, and I spent the first 10 years of my life there. And in a sense, as I reflect now, my life is in somewhat contrast, because as a little girl, life was, you wake up in a house, or not even a house, it was more like poles and a roof and no windows. It was called a hut. And you wake up and it's somewhat more relaxed. It wasn't really time oriented as I have now, and it consisted of running around under coconut trees and also cocoa trees. And I guess on a typical day, you wake up, you pick up breadfruit leaves and make sure that all of those morning chores are done, and then you go to school and you come back. You either help mum and dad go to the plantation and pull out taros. And then dad will come home and he goes to the ocean and get fish, and because that's what they do and because he can. And it's just really weird and different. Yeah.
And what sort of family upbringing did you have? It sounds like you had quite a spiritual upbringing.
Yes, if anything, and that was probably part of a daily routine and very early morning worships, whether you liked it or not, and then evening worships, just to thank God for the day that you've had. And so I think for most islanders, they grew up knowing God and having some kind of a God factor in their lives. And I'm no different in that respect. God was very much a huge part of my upbringing, and prayer and all of those things that come with the God factor in one's life.
Yes,
but it's having that. It's another thing to have a relationship, but that comes later.
So tell us one particular story about your prayer life with your father.
Well, the whole plantation, the whole coconut tree thing, I remember once, and this has probably had a huge impact on me, probably one of the times in my life that I really remember significantly. And Dad, it was an afternoon, and he said, let's go, one of the lands where lots of coconut trees and cocoa trees. He says, the thing they do is they go and collect the mature coconuts, and he says, we'll go. And so he took us kids with them, and really random, well, I thought it was random, but probably not to him, because he was already thinking about it. He said, we need to just stop here for a moment. I'm thinking, okay, and we're stopping here for what reason? And he says, well, let's just kneel here and we need to pray. And I'm thinking, right, it's in the middle of nowhere. There's just greenery and bush and coconut trees and cocoa trees and what there is here. And he says, no, we need to kneel and pray. And I'm like, why? Anyway, so all of us kids, I looked around and they're looking at me all thinking the same thing, going, this is weird. I hope no one comes on this path while we're kneeling and praying. So we knelt. And we prayed, and my dad just prayed this prayer of thanking God for life, and prayed for our lives and prayed for our family. And then we got up and kept going, and I'm like, right, that's pretty cool. But this is, I guess, in a way, a typical thing that used to happen, and that was a huge influence in my life.
Because now as an adult, you have a new appreciation for it.
Oh, yeah. As a kid, you go, oh my goodness, if friends saw this, it was like, oh. But as I reflect on that time, it was the building of my life. You reflect on, in the Bible it says, train up a child in the way that they should go, and they will never depart from it. Now, I know that we all depart in some ways, but to have that kind of upbringing, to have that kind of a building, to have that kind of a foundation to start off with, for me, those are some of the things that I guess were a huge part for me.
And your father also, he was a Seventh-day Adventist, and you were not in a village of Seventh-day Adventists. How did that work?
Well, yeah, they became Adventists just when I was born, and what had happened was their whole extended family were of one particular denomination, a non-Sabbath keeping one, and when my father actually came to a point where he was learning more about the Bible, and it was through an evangelistic meeting that he got to learn all about this. He became converted and gave his heart to Christ and wanted to actually keep the Sabbath and become a Seventh-day Adventist. But the villagers and the whole family actually shunned the family for that. In fact, they actually got kicked out of the village and were called rebels because they did that. So in a way, it was such a, like, for them it's going, no, this is our conviction and you can kick us out. We're gonna become Christians in this respect. And so, yeah.
And what happened? What happened?
Well, they had to actually pack up and leave the village and move to another place. And I think it was 2 villages down the road, which is really like a few minutes walk. But it's a huge deal because your family is actually put to shame, and that's a huge thing in the Samoan culture.
Yes.
And so the whole family name, in fact, their whole extended family, distant themselves from, and so my dad and his brothers at the time had to basically pack up everything and leave the comfort of their home for the mere fact that they became Adventists. So in a way I'm like, well, it must be something to hold on to for them to actually do that.
To sacrifice their whole family to be disowned from their family.
Yeah.
Just to...
Yeah, and all out of
Adventist.
convictions that and what they've grown up now to learn to follow, if that makes sense.
And what sort of thing have you learnt as a result of watching your father in action?
That sometimes following Jesus would mean that you may be rejected by those that you love or that love you because you don't share the same convictions or the same things that you've learnt. But it also means that when you have a solid foundation to your life, that no matter what, you're just going to keep following that. You'll stay firm and stand firm. So, yeah.
That's great. Thanks, Moe.
Thank you.
Stay with us after this break and we'll have more stories from Moe. Welcome back to My Story, His Story. I'm talking with Moe Ioane, Minister and Youth Specialist. Moe, I've really enjoyed hearing your stories from being in a village in Samoa and just the contrast of you being here now. You're now a minister, a youth director, and you know there's plenty more ventures to come. Did you ever think this was going to be where you ended up?
No. If anything, like for probably most of us when you're young, your only adventure is being able to have, you know, breakfast be served and seeing what other toys you can play with during the day and who the friends are that you're going to be meeting. Like you have no concept of the life ahead, you know, and yeah, it's a huge contrast, but one where I reflect and go, wow, this is so cool. God is so awesome, you know, like in a way I sort of reflect in that way and I'm just in awe, like an absolute awe of the way that God has actually, you know, brought the island life into a huge sort of a city life in a way.
Yeah. Well, when I first met you, it was some time ago, you were heavily involved in a choir, a very significant choir in Melbourne in Australia. Tell us a bit about that.
Well, when I first moved to Australia, which was a huge struggle, I didn't want to come here to start with, there was this choir that was made up of youth from all around Melbourne that started, and when I arrived and I went to their first practice, they were going, oh, maybe we could, you know, change leadership or something like that. And I'm like going, hey, that's pretty cool, and this seems like a fun group of young people to actually, you know, hang out with. And they said, oh, you're kind of new, do you want to come and actually, you know, lead out? And I'm like, no, that's kind of crazy. I don't read music, and I like to sing because, you know, well, Islander doesn't know. But, you know, and then they said, no, you could come and do it. And I'm like, it's my first week in Melbourne and you want me to leave. Anyway, so from there, I started this, or at least a passion grew, if you like. I loved it. I loved seeing young people coming together and just singing for God. And, you know, we went to different places in Melbourne and whatnot. And I'm like, wow, this is pretty okay. To the point where I actually found myself in working days. I'm getting paid by a different company. And I was dreaming up things to do that would be for God and church and the young people. I'm like, I'm kind of discontent with that and what I'm doing right now. Like, I could do this sort of full time. But the thing was, like, when you grow up in an island church in particular, you are forced in a way to do things in church, whether you like it or not. And so I felt like my training from that, you get up the front whether you like it or not, and you participate, and you sort of get used to that. But then those skills actually came into this youth choir, and I actually really, really loved it. I loved the interaction, if you like.
Yeah.
Anyway.
And what was the turning point for you to go into ministry?
Well,
full-time ministry.
Yeah, it was in 1998, and it was around about September, October. And my dad was always a man of, you've got to be educated. It's the reason we left the islands, to give you kids an education and so forth. Yeah. And then he said, you've got to be educated. And I thought, yeah, I could go and do studies again, but I'm like, I don't want to just study. And, you know, it's really funny. I actually didn't tell my parents what I was going to study when I left. And I said, okay, I'm going to go and study. But I really felt God's pull, if you like, go and do theology. And I'm like, right, you know what that means. And when I went to actually study theology, I didn't tell my dad or my family what I was doing until like about September, October, later that year, my first year of college. He says, well, what are you studying? And I said, well, I'm studying theology.
And you don't come across as someone who could kind of do the whole theology thing.
No. I'm like, oh my goodness, that means you're going to get stuck in a local church and rah, rah, rah. Anyways. But that was the direction I was heading. And so for me, it was getting involved with young people. And I felt like, even though it felt like the turning point, I know that God started my life off in getting involved in church and so forth to there. And even when I did do theology, I'm like, I'm actually doing this. You know what that means? I'm going to like be ministering in churches and stuff. Like, is that really what I want to do? And you know what? I felt like I struggled even with that whole thought process to the end of the degree. And yeah, hello, 5 years down the line, I'm still doing ministry. So it's like, I don't know how to, it's really an exciting journey if you like, yeah.
And God's led you all the way, and you're probably partly going, I can't believe I'm doing this, but here I am doing this. And I mean, you know, the choir that you were involved in, that was a youth choir. So you've sort of been in youth work, and then you've done local church work, and I know that you were very involved in youth and young children, and now you're doing youth work full time. So, you know, it's sort of something that you've gotten quite passionate about.
Yes, very passionate. If anything, it's one of those things where you probably reflect and you go, I never would have imagined this. But you know what, Kim, like, as I reflect on life, and even just, again, the whole God journey, when as a little girl, the only thing that was important, like beating the boys and climbing coconut trees or something like that. But now I'm like, wow, I'm here, and here is this little island that in a way, when you look at it on the map, you can't actually see. But God saw right through that little dot on the whole world map and go, hey, I could bless you to actually make a difference. And for me, I'm like, I'm here. I love working for him. I love the fact that he can actually use us wherever it is that we've come from and whatever experiences that you have. And you could look at life and go, wow, God is so huge. This world is so amazing. And what amazing opportunities that he can give us to actually be used for him when we are able to take those opportunities and grab it with both hands and feet, if you like, and just go for him. If anything, I look at that, I'm like, wow, God is so cool. So, yeah.
And I guess your life has become your oyster.
Well, my whole thing is, I love the saying of, this world is my oyster, and God has given me this world to enjoy for him. So why not? You know, enjoy it to its fullest. Actually, can I tell you my mission statement?
Oh, quickly, yes.
Well, I really believe that God has given us life, and so for me, I say, well, life is meant to be lived to the fullest, but it's not full when it's not for God's purpose.
Thank you, Moe. Yeah. That's excellent. Yeah. Stay with us after this break, and we have more stories from Moe. Welcome back to My Story, His Story. I've been talking with Moe Ioane. Hi, Moe. I've really enjoyed your stories. They've been awesome. And I just sit here and just think you're just alive. Your ministry is alive. It's fantastic.
It's way alive.
Yeah. But surely there's been some things that have happened to you in your life that have had a real impact on you.
Well, I think each of us have, hence the title of our show right now, and that is, you know, My Story. Every single one of us has a story and various events that have taken place over time that has impacted you. And I think, you know, I always have a saying, life is never dull in more ways than one. And I guess for me, coming from, I have a really close family, and you know, with two sisters and one brother, and the poor boy that has to be surrounded by all these females, and so I grew up in that environment, really solid, really close, and God was a center. But each of us go through various journeys, and with those journeys can impact, you know, each of the members of your family. And probably one of the ones that's probably more recent, and it's actually driving me to continue to live life for God. And even though we all stumble, and I do that, but you know, my first year of ministry, it was halfway through the year, and it was in July. You know, I get a phone call, and my mother is crying on the other line, and I'm thinking, oh, what's happened now, sort of thinking. And she says, you need to come, you know, your brother has been in an accident. And I thought, oh no, like, you know, is he okay? And you know, it became a huge deal, media-wise and family-wise, friendships and so forth. And it was on Sabbath morning, it was about 3 o'clock in the morning, that my brother was driving home, and he had a car accident that caused, you know, deaths. And it was interesting that the day before, when I was visiting with him, he said, Moe, I had a dream last night. And I said, oh? He says, yeah, I had a dream that Jesus came, and I was standing there in front of our house with all of our family, and you were all, like, you know, as the story goes, you were all getting lifted up off the ground, and I was reaching out, and I asked you, because of course you're the minister, and I'm like, ah. And he said, I was asking you, sis, am I going to make it? And when I was having that conversation with him, I wanted to know what my answer was, you know, but he didn't. He said, I woke up and I don't know what happened, but it really shook him up. And then the day after he got into this accident, that, you know, it really changed the course of his own life and all of ours in a huge way. But I think of that because for him, he had to spend some time away. And I've talked with him. I said, you know, as I reflect on it, I work with people, and one of the things that I try and do with this unique person that God has made me into, and that is to say there is so much more to life than what we know now. And you know, like, there will come a day when Jesus will come and all this will end. And for me, that drives me. That question that my brother asked me has been this driving force. Am I going to make it? You know, is when God comes, am I going to be ready? And for me, I'm thinking, I hope that when Jesus comes, that my brother can say that he will be ready. And for me, like, I continue to do this, and I am driven by this thought that people need to be ready when Jesus comes. And for anything, that is one of the probably an impacting time in my life, because it happened to someone close to me. And the question that they asked, that they weren't sure of what the answer was, that I hope if I can help someone to actually have that question be answered and be confident that when they say to me, Moe, am I going to make it? I can say to them, yeah, you're going to make it. And for me, that was a turning point. And yeah, my prayer is that when Jesus does come and my brother turns around to me and say, Moe, am I going to make it? I have to say that he will. Yeah.
Thank you for sharing such a personal story. I'm sure that you've got some spiritual inspiration from the Bible which can keep you going.
Yes. And I guess in a sense, as you know, we reflected, or at least we started off by talking about a small little place. One of the stories, and it's interesting because it's not a hugely significant story in the Bible.
Like the island of Samoa.
Yes, you can't really see it on the map, but it's actually found in the book of 1 Chronicles, chapter 4, verse 9 and 10. And here is a random guy that turns up in the middle of a record telling of the people of Israel, if anything, and right in the middle of telling of the clan of Judah. And it comes a story of a guy called Jabez, and he turns up there for the first time and it ends there. But I love the fact that here is an insignificant, so we see, person that turns up in the middle of nowhere, but yet God, I feel, intended it to be there. And he says that he was more honorable than his brothers, and his mother called him Jabez, saying, I gave birth to him in pain. But, you know, and I think with that in mind, I'm sure he grew up with the life of go, I'm only here as, you know, someone that caused pain. And so here he was. If I was imagining him to be a Samoan young man, he would have been sitting under a coconut tree and say, God, you know, all I know is pain, and that's my life. And he asked God, and he says, oh, that you would bless me and enlarge my territory. Let your hand be with me and keep me from harm, so that I will be free from pain. And God granted his request. And for me, I am inspired by that. Though it was random, though it turned up in the middle of a genealogy of the Judah clan, but for God, nothing is random. And the mere fact that here is this guy that says, God, all I know is pain, but can you please, in my small little life, please extend my influence and my territories. And I think it was for God's purpose that he prayed that, and God actually heard him and he answered that prayer. And for me, I'm inspired by that, because though we may think our life insignificant, it's not. And when we pray for God to use us for a greater purpose and enlarge our atmosphere or our sphere of influence, that he can. So, yeah.
Thank you so much, Moe. I've really enjoyed your stories. They've been great. Thank you so much for joining us on My Story, His Story, and we hope you join us again next time.